Hi there, welcome to Where's the Money Gone, the podcast that takes you inside the football boardroom with me, Adrian Goldberg, and Charlie Methven. I am a West Bromwich Albion season ticket holder, investigative journalist, and the author of Where's the Money Gone, the battle for the soul of English football. That is available now, ready to order, just in time for Christmas. And Charlie is managing director of Mount Pleasant FC in Jamaica. He's a shareholder of RAEC Mons in Belgium, which is where he's recording this episode of the podcast. He was formerly a director of both Sunderland and Charlton Athletic, as well as being a boyhood Oxford United fan. This time, we're talking about the managerial hokey cokey, in, out, shake it all about. Wolves have sacked Vitor Pereira recently, just 45 days after giving him a 3-year contract. They now look likely to bag Rob Edwards, who was only 6 months into his own 3-year contract at Middlesbrough. Pereira is one of 4 Premier League managers sacked already this season. Will Still lost his job at Southampton recently in the Championship, while in Europe, Erik ten Hag lasted just 62 days at Bayer Leverkusen. Are fans and directors too quick to write off head coaches, and how is that decision made? Plus, Mary Earps, England's goalkeeper, turned character assassin, maybe. Has she ruined her legacy in her autobiography? Earps was in goal, of course, when the Lionesses won the Euros in 2022. She picked up the Golden Gloves a year later at the World Cup. But in this autobiography, she has turned her fire on the woman who replaced her in goal, Hannah Hampton, and her former boss, Sarina Wiegman. Lots of headlines, maybe translating to lots of sales, but at what cost to her reputation, I wonder. Charlie, welcome. It was the Where's the Money Gone derby at the weekend. West Brom against Oxford, and the Baggies triumphed 2-1 against the U's.
Moving swiftly on. Earlier in the week, Adrian, I saw you and was lucky enough to join you for a pint in the Docklands of London prior to the other Where's the Money Gone derby between West Brom and Charlton, which went the other way. So I regard this as being a score draw between us this week.
And you're in Belgium. What's the state of play with Mons?
Going for a slightly tricky period at the moment. We drew last night at home in a not a great game, and previous week we lost our first game of the season. We're still top of the table, but we're having a bit of a struggle with soft tissue injuries at the moment. Not major ones, but nonetheless debilitating. All of our forward players pretty much were out last night. And I'm pretty sure that I understand where these soft tissue injuries are coming from, what the origin of them are. It's a sort of longer story for another day. But we're sort of setting about trying to address that situation, as well as obviously starting to think towards what we might do in January to try and push the promotion over the line. In other news, Mount Pleasant completed their semi-final victory in the Caribbean Cup this week, taking them through to the final, which means that we have qualified for the knockout stage of the CONCACAF Champions League, where we will get drawn against one of the big guns of the US or Mexico. So that's a terrific day for the club and for our profile in terms of sort of the more global stage outside of the Caribbean. Now I was sort of trying to work out in my head whether one would want a draw against one of the few minnows, maybe fellow minnows, I should say, maybe from Central America or something like that, to give you a winnable game and potentially provide a route to the quarterfinals, or if you'd just rather go and draw into Miami either way. So anyway, looking forward to all that. The Caribbean Cup final is at the end of this month over 2 legs. If we win the final, we go straight through to the last 16 of the knockout stages. If we lose the final, we go to the last 32. So as I said, plenty going on, bit of a mixed bag. But I guess let's sort of move on to talking about meatier topics.
Well, indeed, managers then. It's the time of year, isn't it, that managers first come under real pressure. Usually they're given at least 10 or 11 games into a season to get their feet under the table. But we're now in sacking season. I mentioned that 4 Premier League managers have gone already. And very often it's a kind of carousel, isn't it? In that Wolves a couple of years ago sacked Nuno. Nuno then moved on to Tottenham Hotspur. He's now at West Ham. and sitting prettily, well, not that prettily maybe, but two places above Wolves in the Premier League title, who in the meantime have sacked their manager, Vitor Pereira, having since Nuno left, having also had Gary O'Neill as boss. And now, at the time of recording this, looking highly likely that Rob Edwards will be appointed. And you were commenting to me just in a text post, Charlie, about really the job of a manager properly getting to grips with a club is takes about 2 years. Is that about right?
I think probably a year to fully get to grips with the job, 18 months for the full sort of, you know, summation of their efforts to come to the point where you're really seeing on the pitch exactly what it was that they might have had in mind when they took the job. And then there's a sort of should be a sort of golden period of another 18 months to a couple of years after that, before in many cases the situation gets a bit stale for one reason or another. Very often in those situations, the manager succeeds upwards. Often they'll get poached during that sort of time if they've been there being successful for 3 years. Or else, if they are not successful, of course, then they often get fired. I think there have been numerous studies made into this, Adrian, over the years, and the conclusions of the studies are very, very clear. On balance, taken in the round, sacking your manager does not make a difference, right? It's a crucial thing to understand. Now, I think what lies behind this is that the influence of the head coach or the manager is overestimated by fans, media, and sometimes directors. I think if you were to ask a fan about, if you were to look deep into a fan's heart or mind and say, if you divide up influence in terms of positive outcomes between the manager, the players, and the support staff, i.e. the technical director and all that kind of thing, what percentage of that would you say the manager perform? Probably it would be something like 50% in the fans' head. I don't know. You can tell me in a moment how you would see it as a fan. Maybe 40%. In truth, in my opinion, as someone working professionally in the industry for 15 years now, the truth is more like 15%, 15%, right? So are they influential? Yes. Are they the single most influential person in the club? Possibly, although I would say the technical director would have a strong claim to that if there is a technical director at the club. Are they able to change fundamental problems that exist inside the club independent of them in a very short-term way? Yes, the famous new manager bounce, right? So a new voice, an injection of freshness, can that do something over a 3-game period to jolt things into a slightly better state for a little while? Yes, but what all the evidence shows is that there is then a reversion to mean. Right now, there have been examples. I'm not going to make the case here. No manager ever deserves to be fired. Right? There are indubitably cases, as there are in all walks of life, when the head coach is the wrong person for that job or has been doing a poor job, and when changing them for the right reasons in the right way with somebody who is better suited to that job will end up producing a better outcome. So, for instance, do I expect, if you think about the move from David Moyes at West Ham, playing quite functional, pragmatic football, to Graham Potter, who would, generally speaking, look to be a more progressive type of coach, the failure of Graham Potter going back to Nuno, who's more similar to David Moyes, would I expect Nuno to do a better job with that setup, which is quite an old-fashioned setup at West Ham, i.e. no great technical director, no great backroom staff and all this type of stuff, but a group of players who on their day can probably do half decently? Would I expect Nuno to do better in that position than I would Graham Potter? Yes. Therefore, was firing Graham Potter the right decision? Yes, but only to correct a mistake made by the board to appoint him in the first place. He should not have been in that position, like Ange Postecoglou should not have been appointed to Nottingham Forest for a round pegs in round holes type reason. Okay, so I think that's just the sort of background context to it. I don't know which area of it you really want to pry into more, Adrian.
Well, a couple of things come to mind. As a fan, I would often say, and as a broadcaster, I often say the single most important appointment that any club can make is a manager. or a head coach, and I'll leave you to discuss that with me in a moment. But the other thing I would say is that you talk about all of the infrastructure behind a manager, the technical director, the medical team, and so on. Can that not be boiled down even more simply? A few years ago, the journalist Simon Cooper and the economist Stefan Szymanski wrote a book called Soccernomics, and
Yeah.
their central thesis was that the money dictates the position. And if you look at elite leagues in European football and you look at wage bills of the clubs in those leagues, there is an almost direct correlation between how much is spent on wages and final league position. Now, there may be clubs who can outperform their wage bill position by 1, 2, or 3 places, in which case the manager has done well. And there may be examples where clubs underperform their wage bill position by 2, 3, or 4 places, and those managers have done poorly. So there is
not just the manager, not just the manager.
Not just the manager. I take your point, but essentially, though, that when you strip away all of these layers, the wage bill is the thing. The wage bill, all things being equal, the wage bill will determine the final position of a club.
Well, all things being equal, but all things are not equal. Some clubs are run well, some clubs are not run well. Over time, using a big data approach with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of clubs and leagues, overall, is underlying finance a significant contributing factor, the most significant contributing factor to the success of those teams? Yes. Are there huge variances that lie within that? Absolutely, yes. So the first thing which I think I'd say to this is that it's very important that a board or a chief executive or a technical director, but let's just take in this case myself as a chief executive, have to be realistic with the head coach about what their KPI is based on budget, right?
That's KPIs, key performance indicators, yeah?
Yes.
That's what you're judging your manager on.
Exactly that. So, and not just the head coach, but the technical director as well. In fact, particularly the technical director, who's the person who often appoints the head coach. So, if you take our position at Charlton, after having sort of come in right at the start of the previous season and sort of slightly sort of caught a falling knife, we then had plenty of time to prepare for the following season. We had Nathan Jones' feet under the table, 6 months already in. We knew that we were going to have about the 5th or 6th biggest budget in the division. So the KPI was to finish 5th. Anything better than that would be regarded as an outperformance. Anything less good than that would be regarded as an underperformance. And that was all laid out, in not just in terms of the finishing position, but in terms of what the average points required to achieve that finishing position would be. So that Nathan, his coaching team, and the technical director were very clear from the start of the season what ultimately they should and would be judged on at the end of the season. So as it turns out, Charlton finished 4th. Right, so a slight overperformance to budget, and then of course they went on to win the playoffs, as it happens. But nonetheless, there was a slight overperformance to budget of about two places, probably. Right, so those are the margins that we're often talking about. However, we do also see situations of much greater underperformance or overperformance. And we've obviously discussed in this podcast before the relative overperformance of Brighton and Brentford over the last 10 years, a considerable overperformance to budget. Very often Brentford will have in the bottom 4 wage bills in the division and still finish mid-table, right? So significant levels of overperformance on a consistent basis. Brighton on a slightly bigger scale, but likewise. And then you look at a club which has just fired its manager. I want to just focus in on one club to explain how I think all this can go wrong. Norwich City. Norwich City have literally just fired their head coach, Liam Manning, having poached him from Bristol in the summer. He was at Bristol doing a good job, got them to the playoffs last year, and left Bristol to join Norwich City. Norwich City would be considered to be a better funded club than Bristol in terms of wage bill. Probably not by a lot, but by a bit. Right, by enough, as you say, to make a significant difference. So if Manning's thinking, I want to become a Premier League manager, I want to go to a club that has the financial clout to get into those playoffs on a regular basis, to give myself a chance of taking a club up to the Premier League, which is probably the only chance I'm going to get of becoming a Premier League manager. That's why I'm going to Norwich, etc., etc. As it happens, he comes from there as well, but leave that to one side. Right. So Manning gets appointed, and 15 games later, Manning gets fired with Norwich second bottom of the table, only to Sheffield Wednesday, who've had a 12-point deduction. Right. Okay. So, oh, Liam Manning, what a terrible manager. Well, shocking, horrific, blah, blah. But is he? His two previous jobs at Bristol City and Oxford United had seen him outperform his budget, right? So has he suddenly become a bad manager? So I then look into Norwich City and find out that since they got relegated from the Premier League, in receipt of 3 years of parachute payments, or maybe it was 2 years, but anyway, receipt of considerable parachute payments, they got relegated in May 2022. So that's 3.5 years ago, since when they have had 6 managers, 5 permanent, one on a caretaker basis, right? Now, not long after they got relegated from the Premier League into the Championship, they appointed a technical director called Ben Napper. I don't know Ben Napper. I've got nothing against Ben Napper, and I'm very aware myself, painfully aware, of how difficult it can be to be put in the spotlight when you are in the football industry. And I don't even know what particular constraints that he's operating under, etc. But I'll make the following observations. Looking at Ben Napper's CV, he was not qualified to become a technical director. He had operated as the loans manager at Arsenal, and prior to that as a video analyst. Right now, the loans manager is a fairly lowly job at a big football club. Smaller football clubs don't even have them, but at a big football club, you might have 5 or 6 players, young players at any one time, who are due to go out on loan. Your job is to find them the right club to go to, and then to go and visit them whilst they're at those clubs and make sure that they're being looked after in the right way and their progress is being tracked, and that the people in the first team environment are aware of how those players are getting on in their loan spell. It's a necessary job. It's a good job, and I'm not knocking it at all. But the jump from being a loans director, and at this point Ben Napper was 35 years old, the jump from being a loans manager to being a technical director fundamentally misunderstands the role of the technical director and massively understates the level of experience required to be an effective technical director. So since then, Norwich have had 5 managers, and the one constant is Ben Napper, right? Who may well be a very proficient video analyst, a very proficient loans manager, but is turning out to not be a successful technical director. So if I'm the Norwich board and I'm watching this procession of managers and changes in style and different players coming in from lots of different directions and all this type of stuff and big payoffs all the time, because if you're poaching Liam Manning from Bristol City, my guess is that probably Norwich would have had to put him on £1 million a year, and probably they would have had to pay him a year to a year and a half his salary to leave, but then you got all his staff, etc., etc. So probably the cost of the Manning mistake, if it is a mistake, and I slightly contest that probably he's entirely responsible for it, is probably going to be around about 2 to 3 million for Norwich, right? Which, when you think that Norwich might have total revenues of 30 million, is 10% of their entire revenues going on a managerial mistake. So you have to look behind these things. And even then, I would say it can't just be about Ben Napper. What about the board who appoints Ben Napper and oversees Ben Napper? What about the support staff that lie around that? I haven't had a look at Norwich's injury record, but what's their injury record been like over the last 18 months? Have they got the right performance department set up? What's their training? What are their training pitches like? What are their recovery protocols like? What's their recruitment like? Because it's highly unusual to have a technical director who had not himself worked as a head of recruitment before. Right? So there's just a whole bunch of stuff that's going on here. But when push comes to shove, the fans will say, we've lost 6 matches in a row at home, sack Liam Manning. Because it's them.
And can I say there, Charlie, I suppose this is where I've spoken before about supporters being infantilized by the ownership model of English football, which says that our clubs are run by wealthy people. Our job is to turn up and support the team, and we are fed information according to the club's dictates. When the club says we can know something, we can know something. We have no right to know what's going on inside the club, and we're not stakeholders other than as fortnightly fans.
That's not true.
Well, let me finish. Let me finish, and you can come back to me. And I think that as fans, therefore, the only person we see speaking about our club, whichever club we support, I'd say in general, is the head coach. The head coach will often say when things are going wrong, I take full responsibility for what's going wrong. And they are the person who, even if things are not ideal behind the scenes, they are the person who selects the players, who sets the training schedule, who will select the team and the formation. And of course, as my mum used to say, once they cross that white line, they can't tell them what to do. But nevertheless, they are responsible for quite a lot, and we as fans see them as being the face and the voice of the club. So if things are going wrong, I'd say there's a kind of natural connection between what we see and how we react.
Yes. Okay. First of all, fans are stakeholders. 100%. The majority of money that is being spent is the fans' money. So in my mind, fans are absolutely core stakeholders and deserve to be communicated with, right? Not just by the manager, but, as is fairly apparent, when I'm the chief executive of the club, I myself communicate very regularly. Now, some fans appreciate that communication, and some certain clubs where they do appreciate that type of communication. At other clubs, they just don't want to hear it. They don't want to hear some suit, as they would call it, talking. All they're interested in is what the manager's got to say. So you can probably guess of my recent clubs which one falls into which bucket. But almost exactly this time last year, when Charlton was struggling a little bit, not horribly, but we were struggling a little bit. And I wouldn't say that there were exactly incessant calls to fire Nathan Jones, but it was definitely being aired fairly publicly, and occasionally at matches and this type of stuff. So I stepped out and did an interview with the local newspaper, a long form interview with the local newspaper, in large part explaining why we weren't going to do that. And I think that's important. Is you say, if we're not going to infantilize fans, we need to lay out what our thinking is and our reasoning is, and at least engage with the idea that some of the fans, and perhaps a greater proportion of the fan base than one might imagine, are going to be interested to hear it, and it's going to enable them to balance out their view on it more, and it's also going to perhaps spread the responsibility from just being the manager and to a degree the players in a more general collective responsibility type of way. And
But
actually, it
I'd
was
say,
interesting.
Charlie, you are the exception. I mean, here you are talking on this podcast regularly and explaining the inner workings of a football club, which is hugely beneficial to supporters. But I would suggest that at most clubs, that does not happen. That when there is a time of crisis at a football club, the chairman, usually, sometimes the technical director, might step out and issue the dreaded vote of confidence. And we know that that is usually followed by dismissal. But people other than the head coach rarely offer what politicians might describe as a running commentary on the club. And perhaps they don't need to do that. But I would suggest that having some kind of regular communication from your technical director, from your chair, maybe once a month, just to kind of contextualize the way the club is and to make sure that fans understand that the head coach isn't the sole person responsible for performances, but maybe directors, maybe technical directors don't want to do that because the head coach is a convenient shield when things go wrong.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure it's done deliberately, but you're probably right in saying that there is an element of, ducking for cover, and because the manager contractually has to go and speak, then effectively it enables other people in the organisation to not speak. But I do think that's somewhat cowardly. I do think you have to wear it a little bit more than that. But I just want to return to the importance of the behind-the-scenes appointment. It's almost exactly 5 years since Stuart Donald, Juan Sartori, and I appointed Christian Speakman to be technical director of Sunderland. Almost exactly 5 years, and subsequently Stuart Harvey to be the head of recruitment. During those 5 years, I think there have been 3 or 4 managers. One has left, as he saw it, to go promoted upwards. In case of Alex Neil, one or 2 others left for different reasons. There was a sort of misstep with Michael Beale in the middle of it, so it's not that everyone gets everything right all the time. But fundamentally, those 5 years, having built a proper bedrock, have seen continuous progression. And really, I think that is how boards should be judged, which is the quality of the people and the work that gets done in these, what I would call permanent positions, acknowledging the fact that the head coach's position is probably, for good reasons or bad, going to change on average once every 2 years, something like that, right? So if you have the right technical director, if you have the right head of recruitment, if you have the right performance director, etc., then head coaches, almost regardless of whether they are geniuses or not, can look very good. Look at Brighton. So Brighton have been able to lose their head coach on a regular basis to be poached by other organisations. The new guy comes in and he immediately looks like he's just as good, if not better, than the previous guy. Is that because he is just as good, if not better, than the previous? No, it's because he's coming into such a strong setup where everything's being done in the right way and things are being thought through in a logical way. So I guess the long and the short of it is, because we need to get on to talk about Mary Earps, is that it's the only lever that you can pull in the short term that relieves some of the pressure that's building on the organisation. You can't change your players, and you can make changes to the backroom staff, but the effect of those won't be felt for quite some time, and fans won't necessarily understand it, will thank you for it, or whatever it might be in the short run. So these managerial changes quite often get made out of desperation to be seen to do something, and very often even the people making the decisions don't really believe that it is actually the right decision. They just know we've got to do something.
Yes, and we will talk about Mary Earps, but I think one of the dimension that we haven't discussed, and I think is hugely important in this, Charlie, is fan behaviour on the terraces. I don't mean match day violence or anything like that, but I mean that there can be situations, and I'm sure every fan watching this will understand what I'm talking about, and this has been an experience of mine at West Brom, but every club I think goes through this, where a managerial appointment, even a relatively recent one, is so opposed by the fans that the atmosphere in the stadium becomes utterly toxic. Sometimes supporters end up fighting with each other, certainly arguing with each other. It's destructive to the players on the pitch because there's a willingness to seize on every mistake, and that is then followed by a process of people staying away because either they don't like the toxic atmosphere or because the football is perceived to be not very good, not very exciting. And our own manager, Ryan Mason, was under pressure until the weekend's win against Oxford. And people said it wasn't just the results, it's because the football was boring, it was joyless. So those things can't be ignored by a board of directors, can they? Even if they think they've made the right appointments, if things really turn in the stadium, it's impossible to ignore that, isn't it?
Yeah, that is true. Once the relationship is torn between the fan base and the head coach, properly torn, then unfortunately you enter into a vortex where even if the head coach originally might have had the skill set to do that job, they are now in a position where the atmosphere around the whole situation makes it almost impossible for them to do so. And we had that situation once at Charlton, and it was, deeply unpleasant and very unfortunate. But that's the way sometimes that it goes. Anyhow, as I said, I think probably best on to Mary Earps, because that's quite a sort of large topic as well.
Yeah, Mary Earps published her autobiography recently called All In, and I think the juiciest bit of it from a punter's perspective is revealing insights as to why she walked away from the Lionesses for the most recent Euros. Of course, England won in 2022 with Earps in goal. They won again in 2025 with Hannah Hampton in goal. But by this time, on the eve of those most recent Euros, Earps had walked out. And in her autobiography, she presents the case that she believed Hannah Hampton had been a disruptive presence in the dressing room, and that she felt that by bringing her back in for a key qualifier, that her manager Sarina Wiegman had behaved in a way that she regarded as unprofessional. She didn't want the disruptive influence that she perceived Hannah Hampton to be, and she felt that her relationship then with Sarina Wiegman and the honesty of that relationship had been compromised, which is why she decided to walk away. It's all very sad, I think, really, because here we are reflecting on two successive Euros that have been won by the Lionesses, Charlie.
But is it sad? It's probably the first time that I've started to think that women's football might be interesting. There's there's been this sort of rather sickly, saccharine, sort of Disney-fied version of the Lionesses for the last 5 years. Sort of see no evil, hear no evil. They're all perfect people, perfect representatives of modern Britain, diversity, blah, 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 blah. And for me, that's not real life and never was likely to be real life, and is also just boring. And part of why we all get engaged in sport, whether it be men's sport or women's sport, is personalities, perceived sort of differences and problems and all these types of stuff. It's all part of the rich tapestry that enables us to take an interest in fundamentally what is a bunch of people we don't know running around a patch of grass. Or, you know, in the case of tennis, you know, a tennis court, you know, whatever it might be, you know. So for me, I'm glad that she's been honest. I think what's quite clear, just doing some very basic research, is that what she says about Hannah Hampton is true, right? This is not the first time that somebody has said that Hannah Hampton is disruptive. This seems to be fairly well attested from previous clubs, former colleagues, people in the know, etc., that she is a difficult, petulant, tricky person, right? Now, the goalkeepers, remember, always train together. So you might get the whole of the rest of the outfield squad, 22 players, training on a main pitch, and then the 2 or 3 goalkeepers spend hours and hours and hours with their goalkeeping coach on their own, right? So those relationships are much more intense than they are between normal players, because they spend so much of their working lives in a very tight working environment together. And normally what it means is that they get on great. That's been my experience of goalkeepers, is that your 2 or 3 goalkeepers in each squad will tend to end up becoming great friends and end up being much more supportive of each other than actually other positions on the pitch, because in some way they call it the goalkeepers union, don't they? They're aware that they are in the most vulnerable, you know, position on the pitch. One mistake leads to a goal and so on and so forth. So they tend to form a tight little group. They're often, in many cases, slightly eccentric figures, rather like wicket keepers in cricket. And they sort of hang together and they eat together. They're often physically different sizes to the rest of the players and all this stuff. So obvious who the goalkeeper is. So in this case, Mary Earps was clearly, you know, used to having a close working relationship with her fellow goalkeepers, and found that this young upstart was not an easy person to work with. And then when that young upstart, who's clearly extremely talented, effectively grew past her to take her position, she threw her toys out the pram, said, well, I'm not hang around to be that person's number 2, and then writes a book about it. Well, you can make all sorts of judgments about it, but it's all quite fun for me. People talk about how has Mary Earps spoilt her legacy. Well, her legacy is of winning the Golden Gloves and winning major championships and all that type of stuff. The other part of her legacy, in as much as that she's some sort of saint-like figure who's never done anything wrong in her life and is the perfect person, well, it's a sort of fake anyway. I mean, why would you want your legacy to be a fake? She actually says, yeah, what's the title to her autobiography?
All in, all in. And she said, I think this may be the point you're driving to, Charlie. She says that to have just stayed on and collected the medal wouldn't have been authentic. And I think, in fairness to her, she has been authentic in this book. She does talk about, and I know you wouldn't make light of this either, the really serious psychological struggles that she went through whilst being England goalkeeper, and the pressure that goes with that. In Hannah Hampton's defence, I don't know. As you say, there have been other reports of her allegedly disruptive behaviour. I do know that she has herself fought an incredible battle to become a top goalkeeper. People will know that she had a problem with her sight as a young woman and has had operations to overcome that. She doesn't have the regular depth of field of what's it called? She doesn't have the regular depth of vision of people with, if you like, regular sight. So she's overcome a lot to become the Lionesses goalkeeper. And
that's great, isn't it? Isn't it great? Right.
yeah,
So you got Mary Earps, who, you know, if you read the book, and I've read bits of it, has had either has had a difficult life or perceives that she has had a difficult life, and maybe a bit of a mixture of both. There's definitely a somewhat victim-like tone throughout the entire book, which is somewhat unusual for somebody who was extremely successful and very wealthy. Leaving that to one side. And clearly Hannah Hampton's had a complex life as well. And for me, this is part of what brings me into sport, which is I don't want all these people to be uncomplicated, sort of just little goody two shoes saint like figures, etc. I grew up watching like McEnroe and Jimmy Connors and Nick Faldo mouthing off at Sandy Lyle and sort of, Ballesteros trying jingling coins in his pocket to put people off the top of their backswing and all this type of stuff. I'm not interested in these saintly figures, and I think it'll be all to the good of women's football. One of the things that most irritates me about watching or listening to women's football is that the commentators and analysts seem to feel the need to say that every single thing is great, right? There is no criticism. Like, oh, well, it's very difficult. No, come on. We're all in professional sport here. Call
Yeah,
out,
yeah, but
be honest.
I think that's partly the function of modern sport and modern packaging and modern branding and the way in which broadcasters are effectively in bed. I mean, metaphorically, not literally, the way that broadcasters are in bed with the sports that they produce. And I think that,
Doesn't
we
happen
do.
in doesn't happen in men's football, does it? Doesn't stop Roy Keane and Jamie Carragher telling it how it is and all this type of stuff. I mean, it is for me, it's very particular to women's football. It has been that this little sheen and this little protective bubbles put around the whole thing. The people
But
who
I
commentate
think I'm making you're right, I think, about men's football, and maybe that's because of the other commentary that there is around it. But, when you have, going away from football here, and I'm conscious of time, but when you have the 100, for example, a newly conceived sport, which has broadcasters like Sky and the BBC who are signing up to film or show this sport, they're also effectively promoting it as well, aren't they? And I think women's football is a little bit in that space where you have broadcasters not merely saying, here is this product, here is this entertainment that you can watch. They are also part promoters of that product by virtue
yes,
of showing it.
yeah.
And they
Well,
have an interest in bigging it up rather than being honest about it. Men's football has been there for decades, and so they're not promoting it in that way. It has a
yeah,
narrative around it that is a bit more contrary, I think.
yeah, that's definitely true. But if you think, I think they're just wrong in their conception that the way to promote their sport is by making it really boring. A wonderful moment 2 or 3 years ago when in golf, Brooks Koepka, I think, is being interviewed, and as Bryson DeChambeau walks past, and it's just immediately clear from what Brooks Koepka says that he absolutely hates DeChambeau, and he isn't willing to hide it. And that then drives not just a narrative for that occasion. It means the next time they play against each other, there's a lot of noise and narrative about it. You remember when we were young in Formula One, Senna and Prost and all these types of people. You need this stuff in sport. Otherwise, it's just flies racing up a wall. We need personality. We need meaningfulness. So all power to Mary Earps' pen. Well done, Mary. You've actually made women's football interesting for me. Thank you.
So there's your lesson for women's football. Get more dirt out there. That's what we want. Charlie,
Actually,
thank you. Thank you.
just on that point, because it's the sport I grew up with and worked in professionally first time is horse racing. And there is no doubt that the popularity of horse racing was partially founded on Dick Francis and his novels. A little bit of grime and dirt never harmed anyone.
Charlie, thank you. Thank you to Jed Thomas for his production assistance with this episode, and to Mark Machado at 1129 Media and his team for our work and our socials. We'll see you again next week. Thanks for listening. Here's to dirt. Thanks, Charlie. See you later.